Our main focus today for our MCAS review is going to be some more algebra. In particular, we're going to focus a lot on factoring. So let's start off by talking about the different methods of factoring. So the first method of factoring is when you factor out a GCF. When you're doing this, you are finding the largest term that divides evenly into each term in the expression, and then you're going to write what is left over inside the parentheses. So let's take a look at an example. We have 5x cubed minus 15x squared plus 25x. So we want to find the largest term that will go evenly into all three of these terms. In this case, it looks like 5 is a GCF, and x is also part of the GCF. So 5x is going to be the GCF that I want to factor out. Okay, so what goes inside the parentheses? Inside the parentheses, you're going to be writing down what's left over. So if I take out 5x from 5x cubed, I'm left with x squared. If I take out 5x from the second term, that leaves us with negative 3x. And if we factor out the 5x from 25x, that leaves us with just 5. So this will be plus 5. And that's it. We've successfully factored out the GCF. All right, the next type of factoring is factoring by splitting the middle. This is when you have three terms, or what we call a trinomial, and you're going to split the middle term into two terms that multiply to a times c and add to b. Okay, so let's see how this works. So in example 2, we have 2x squared minus 3x minus 9. Now, the thing is, we need to find the two things that we're going to split the middle term into. So what we're going to do is we're going to first start off by multiplying by AC. So in this case, 2 and negative 9, that's negative 18. And then I'm going to put B in the bottom of the x. That's negative 3. So now I'm trying to find two terms that are going to multiply to negative 18 and add to negative 3. So you want to list out pairs of numbers that will multiply to negative 18. So 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6, until you can find the pair that you can use that you can be able to add together and get to negative 3. In this case, negative 6 and positive 3 will multiply to negative 18 and add to negative 3. Okay, so we have found the two things that we're going to split the middle term using. So we're going to keep the 2x squared and the minus 9 the same, but we're going to split that negative 3x in our expression into negative 6x and positive 3x. Okay, so we've done the splitting the middle portion. Now to finish off the factoring, we're going to group the first two terms together and factor out a GCF, and group the second two terms together and factor out a GCF. So for the first two terms, the GCF here would be 2x, and that leaves us with x minus 3. And in the last two terms, we have a GCF of 3, and factoring that out, we're left with x minus 3. Now those two parentheses should always be the same if you split the middle correctly. The last thing you need to do is you need to write this in factored form. So you're going to take what's outside of the parentheses and write that as one factor, so the 2x plus 3. And then the x minus 3, the part that's repeated in both expressions, as another factor. So in factored form, this is just 2x plus 3 and x minus 3. All right, the third type of factoring we're going to go over is when you're factoring what we call a difference of squares. So this happens when you have the difference of two terms that are both perfect squares. So the difference meaning it has to be subtraction in between, and they both have to be perfect squares. Now, how do you actually go about factoring? You'll take the square root of each of those perfect squares, and then in one of the parentheses, you will have a positive or a plus in between, and the other one will be negative. You'll have a minus in between. All right, so take a look at example 3. We have 4x squared minus 25. So we have a difference of two terms, and those two terms are both perfect squares. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this as two sets of parentheses. I'm going to start off with the 4x squared, and I'm going to find the square root of that. So the square root of 4x squared is 2x. So I'm going to write 2x in the beginning of both sets of parentheses. Now we'll deal with the 25. Don't worry about the minus, just the 25. So the square root of 25 is 5, so I'm going to write 5 again in both sets of parentheses. And then the last thing we're going to do is one of these has to be positive and one has to be negative. So 2x plus 5 and 2x minus 5. And that is our expression in factored form. All right, the last type of factoring we're going to go over is what we call factoring by grouping. And this method is used when you have four terms. When you have these four terms, what you're going to do is you're going to split the expression into two smaller groups of terms and factor those groups by GCF factoring. Whatever is left over should end up being identical in both parentheses, and then you'll be able to write it in factored form. All right, so take a look at example 4. We have four terms, x cubed minus 4x squared plus 3x minus 12. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to split the expression into two smaller groups of terms. So I'm going to group the x cubed minus 4x squared together, and then the 3x minus 12 together. Now for each group of terms, I'm going to try to factor out a GCF. So factoring out a GCF from the first group, I believe the GCF is x squared here. So this will leave us with x squared times x minus 4. And then in the second group, our GCF looks like is going to be positive 3. And that leaves us with x minus 4. Now you'll notice here that in both sets of parentheses, what's left over is identical. So now we can write this in factored form. So in factored form, this will be x squared plus 3 and x minus 4. And that's it. All right, the last thing we're going to go over is related to factoring, but is not a factoring method in and of itself. The last thing we're going to talk about is how do you solve a quadratic? So a couple of steps. First, you want to set the equation equal to 0. Once you've done that, then you want to see if you can factor, if it's at all possible. Now, if it's not factorable, you'll end up having to use the quadratic formula, but we're going to see if it's factorable. And if it's factorable, factor it, and then you're going to set each of those factors equal to 0 and solve for x. Let's take a look at example 5. We have m squared minus 3m equals 28. Now instead of x, we have m here, but the same steps apply. All right, so the first step is to set the equation equal to 0. So right now we have 28 on the right-hand side. I'm going to try to move that over to the left so that I have 0 on the right. So I'm going to subtract 28 from both sides. So that gives me m squared minus 3m minus 28 equals 0. And now we have to try to factor. Now in this case, we have 3 terms, so we're probably going to want to split the middle. I won't go through that whole process, but you know how to do that now. So going through that process, we should end up with this in factored form, and that would be m minus 7 times m plus 4 equals 0. Now that we have it in factored form, we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So I'm going to take m minus 7, that's one factor, set it equal to 0. Take m plus 4, that's another factor, set that equal to 0. And then for each one, I'm going to solve for m. So adding 7 to both sides, that gives me m equals 7. And subtracting 4 from both sides, that gives me m equals negative 4. So for my answers, I have m equals 7 and m equals negative 4.